If I can draw on, your experience, you really do talk about in your most recent book, as I recall, the oath that the president takes and the idea that the president and the presidency have an allegiance to certain values that underpin this nation. It would appear that, sadly, those values seem to be receding with this incoming administration.
Oh yeah, I think there are two traditions. The argument of the presidents and the people are there are really two traditions of thinking about the Constitution, American history, and both claim to show allegiance to the Constitution. One is a democratic tradition, and that's often represented not by state officials or even presidents, but by citizens who oppose authoritarianism. And often it's citizens who are kind of calling presidents to account by pointing to the idea that they're supposed to, as you say, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And some presidents have lived up to that. And in fact, the way that we've often recovered from authoritarianism is that citizens calling out authoritarian presidents have almost never relied on the courts. They've relied instead on politics and on the idea of recovering with future presidents. But we also have another sad tradition in the country's history, and that's of authoritarian presidents claiming their own vision of the Constitution to do basically whatever it is they want. And often that means shutting down the opposition, as John Adams did, for instance, or arguing for the idea that Black Americans aren't even people under the Constitution, as President Buchanan did, or arguing for second-class citizenship as the core of American values, as Woodrow Wilson did. So we have these two traditions, one democratic idea of the Constitution and one authoritarian, and it's obvious where we're headed, very deep into the authoritarian one. That's what's coming next. And that's the argument of this new book, The Presidents and the People, 5 leaders who threatened democracy and the citizens who fought to defend it. And the 5 leaders are all pre-Trump, but it's all about Trump. When you look at these examples, every single one of them really speaks to the way that he's threatening the democratic idea of the Constitution.
And so in the book, The Presidents and the People, we see, you're saying, the emergence of an opposition that ultimately is effective in pulling these presidents who have authoritarian instincts or leanings back from that authoritarianism?
Absolutely. On the one hand, it's a book that tries not to stray from the warning that the presidency is extremely dangerous, despite the high ideals that you and I started off by talking about. And those high ideals, are often claimed not by the presidents who threaten democracy, but by citizens who fight back. And the point of the book, the hopeful part, at the same time that it's honest about the danger of American democracy and the danger of the presidency in particular, given its power. It's always been powerful and always been dangerous. But the hopeful part is that, right, these citizens have fought back and they've won. And so when we look at, how dire things look, we've been here before and we've recovered. And again, it's never the court really that saves us. It's always citizens taking matters into their own hands, and specifically by forming what I call democratic constitutional constituencies to rally around recovery presidents. So in the first instance, the first case study, it's John Adams' really vicious shutdown of the opposition, as opposed by the people who were shut down, the editors who made their own trials a trial of Adams, and they prevail on Jefferson, but really Madison to put the right to dissent, the right to free speech back.
Can you speak to that just to give us a sense of that? Like when you talk about shutting down when Adams tried to shut down the opposition, can you speak to what that looked like?
Wow, it really wasn't metaphorical, and it's exactly what Trump is promising to do. John Adams did do in 1798. He signed the Sedition Act, and the Sedition Act was structured as a way of actually eliminating opposition to Adams' reign. And so it was written in a way that said that if you criticize the president of the United States, essentially go to prison. If you criticize the vice president, you're scot-free. Now, why would you structure it that way? The vice president at the time was Thomas Jefferson, a member of the opposition party in opposition to Adams. So from the beginning, and a lot of times, like people like McCullough and other historians, we tend to love presidents and presidential history, and they were so brilliant. So McCullough and the miniseries that comes from his work just downplay this moment. But we know now is 126 prosecutions of the opposition. Trump's threatened 100 people. This is 26 more that were actually gone after, that were prosecuted. And, they included a sitting congressman, Matthew Leon, a member of the opposition party, the main editors who were criticizing Adams' policies. So this happened. It wasn't just an attempt. He really did shut down the opposition party. And of course, we're coming off January 6th. And one of the craziest cases that I talk about is one where an editor uncovered Adams' plot to basically cheat in the Electoral College by putting cronies in place on the day of certification of the election to ensure that the votes wouldn't be certified unless they were for Adams. And it's exactly the plot that John Eastman and Trump came up with. So, that's the theme. The hope comes from the fact that we've been here before, but that we've prevailed in the end.
The kind of support he has from his henchmen, I mean that generically, the support he has, I'm talking about Trump, does that also have a parallel in history?
Yeah. We could just, I think it's true of each of these examples has a deep parallel, including to this idea of just diehard loyalists who are willing to do whatever he wants. One of the things that seems so appalling to us, rightly, by the way, is the way that so many of the justices, Clarence Thomas, sort of is just one example, are the president's henchmen. They just decided a case that gave him a get out of jail free card for the most dangerous acts that really anyone in the world could commit, the official acts as president. And that's where a president, of course, is at his highest power. And you might think that's unprecedented, but no, actually, that's exactly what happened during Adams. In fact, Samuel Chase, the most prominent Supreme Court justice of the time, works with Adams' party to shut down the opposition. And in fact, one of the most prominent editors, Samuel Chase, is on trial for simply criticizing Adams, the kind of stuff that Saturday Night Live would consider tame at this moment. Chase, the Supreme Court justice, ensures that he doesn't even bring up the right to free speech, that he can't defend himself by sitting on the trial. So these guys were, we think that we're in trouble now. It was even more blatantly partisan then.
I mean, should we take heart in that, Corey? I mean, it's a weird thing to say because it looks like we're about to see this incredible train wreck.
That's right. I do think you can take heart. It requires honesty. So much of our history, we're lied to about what happened. And, the way that works is we create all these past presidents that they were all heroes. And Adams, is the most recent example. And so I think that's sort of given us a naive sense of what American politics is. American politics has always had a loaded gun in it, and that's the presidency. It is very dangerous and has been from the beginning. And in fact, in the question of whether or not even to ratify the Constitution, Patrick Henry, the revolutionary hero, was against ratifying the Constitution. He says, look, what if you have a criminal president? What's going to happen to this criminal president? What will stop him? Well, it's supposed to be impeachment, but that won't work if the co-partisans are there. What about indictment? Well, who's going to do the indicting? That's unlikely to work. And his worry was that a criminal president would see that he couldn't be stopped and would basically claim dictatorship. So that danger is very real. It's been there from the beginning. So why is it that I find hope in this crazy story? It looks like we should be petrified. And the answer is that because even in the face of these dire moments, Adams didn't prevail, that citizens, like your show, people speaking out throughout media and on social media, they were able to stop him. And that's what I think is going to happen again, that we'll be able to stop this wannabe tyrant.
Just looking at comments as you are speaking, and one is, what did Orwell say about the truth? Intellectual honesty is a crime in any totalitarian country, but even in England, it is not exactly profitable to speak and write the truth. There is a fear that can cow opposition, right?
Man.
And you're seeing it already as the Bezoses of the world, they fold like pup tents to this incoming administration. Zuckerberg as well. These are extremely powerful people with massive social media machines that can propel any narrative they want. Can you speak to that?
I think that's, been true from the beginning, that you see very quickly that as authoritarians try to claim power, that many people are just too willing to go along with it, partly out of fear. I mean, one of the craziest parts of this episode that we're beginning with, the Adams shutdown of the opposition, is Jefferson is vice president sitting there watching. He actually attended the Senate as this authoritarian Sedition Act is passed, and he's worried about speaking out because he thinks he can be in prison, won't be in place to really help the country to recover. So that fear is very real. And yes, it's disheartening that we're seeing so many corporate leaders defect so quickly. And Bezos and Zuckerberg, of course, are the most prominent. And we'll see more of that. And yet, if there's no opposition, there really is no way to recover. Part of I guess, I want my book to be realistically hopeful, but not naively so, because there is nothing in the Constitution, nothing in the facts of recovery of the past that will survive this. I mean, you really could have a collapse, as Patrick Henry warned, into a kind of criminal authoritarianism. And it really depends on, people speaking out. Now, one thing that people ask me all the time is, but isn't the media so fragmented now? And it's true. We've had periods of American history where we had our Walter Cronkite, who could speak out against authoritarians like McCarthy. But in the founding, that's not true. Media is as fragmented or more than it is now. So many of these editors, their readers were in the thousands, not in the tens of thousands even, And so I think part of the message is that, like, or Frederick Douglass, who really is the hero of the book, and at a time when African Americans are denied by the Dred Scott case and President Buchanan all rights under the Constitution, he's able to use his following of really a few thousand subscribers to Frederick Douglass's paper and the North Star to create opposition that eventually snowballs into success. And so that's part of my message too, that even shows and podcasts and Mark Thompson Live, even if the listenership and viewership isn't in the millions, it's in the thousands, that's enough, and that can work and is essential, actually, especially as corporate media starts to abandon the role that they need to play in calling Trump out. I worry, of course, about well, we saw Morning Joe, for instance, and other media already not quite taking the stand that they should be taking. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is it's an interesting media landscape that exists now. Fewer readers, fewer getting the newspaper, fewer newspapers. Huge news deserts. And if you look at the numbers, just as into this digression or whatever that we're kind of getting into, how media and how opposition expresses itself and finds a way to connect with the populace. If you look at those news deserts, Trump won over 50% of those voters in places that there were news deserts, where there's really no newspaper serving those communities, and you're only getting the tepid local news broadcasts, which are if it bleeds it leads kind of thing, and whatever handout is being provided, and not to mention the immense chain of radio and television stations owned by right-wing companies like Sinclair. So I'm of course a pessimist,
Yeah.
but I cling to optimists. So I have a welcoming disposition toward optimists. But I must tell you, I just feel like there's a grim few years ahead.
Definitely, and I don't want to hide from that. I agree with that. I mean, the hopefulness, I think, comes from the fact that we can prevail, and part of it too, as we're getting into this discussion that I'm trying to point out as things look, and again, I'm not hiding from how bleak they do look, and they're bleak partly because of this isn't any office that Trump has. It's the office of the presidency, arguably the most powerful political office in the world. Control over the nuclear arsenal without any real check on it, for instance. Commander-in-chief power, which we're already seeing despite his, fake isolationism at a moment's notice. He turns into a warmonger and talking about taking over Greenland. So where does the hope come from? I mean, it partly comes from imagining ourselves back into these other moments. So if you think about what it was like to be one of these 126 people facing prosecution, or even the sitting vice president facing potential prosecution, A very real possibility that Jefferson was going to be prosecuted by his political opponent. Or I mentioned, I'll come back to Frederick Douglass, who actually has to flee the country because he's being hunted by Buchanan and his allies, including the governor of New York, and flees to Canada and then to the UK, where he gives some of his most famous speeches about the idea of a democratic constitution. It looked impossible that America was going to have a constitution that defended the basic rights of Black Americans during that period of Buchanan, or during the earlier period of the founding, that we would have a right to criticize the president, a right that Adams explicitly didn't believe in. And yet we prevailed. So even in our darkest moments, and this I don't think is the darkest, I think it's maybe equal to some of those moments.
It's a photo finish, is it, in
not
darkness?
The worst.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not clearly the worst. It's a photo finish, I think, right? We still prevailed. So that's part of it, that the system has proven resilience, if the opposition remains, and even if it's small, it's got to be there. And it is there now. I mean,
Well, let me just follow up on that, though. I mean, the opposition party seems pretty lame, just to speak frankly, in terms of their in terms of the pushback on what's happening. They're lame, and they, and I wouldn't mind if, in our moments together, if you commented on the Merrick Garland thing. Merrick Garland, I've been railing on him since he was appointed. I've always thought that was a bad appointment. He slow walked everything for 2 years, and then, again, now we let the clock run out on Trump being held to account for anything. But anyway, leave him aside for a moment. But I do want to visit with that question. The opposition just doesn't seem to be there. The Democrats just don't seem to be. They don't have that Frederick Douglass in them.
That's right. But, it never came from the party. It never came either from government officials, the real opposition that saved us in these dire moments. And again, they were very dire, equal to this, authoritarian moments of the past. And it didn't come from public officials, and it also didn't come from political parties. It came from citizens who organized themselves and then galvanized themselves around official candidates. So if you take Douglass, he's just, it's not that, he sees Lincoln in the wings, for instance, in 1860. And when Lincoln is elected, he says, there's no difference between the parties. Lincoln at the time is still believes that Dred Scott is wrongly decided, but it's the law of the land. He's a moderate, I think would be a polite way to put it. He believes the Fugitive Slave Act is wrong, but should be enforced. And Douglass is like, this is the opposition. We need something so much more radical. And he stands apart from the party, pushing party leaders and pushing Lincoln himself in a series of conversations directly in person into a more radical, decent stance on behalf of the basic rights of Black Americans. The newspaper editors, there really isn't an organized system of political parties, and they take advantage of that in shaping the agenda of the election of 1800 more than than Jefferson himself did. And I don't think Jefferson particularly loved free speech, but these editors did, and they made it, the election of 1800, about free speech. So again, that's the other part of the hope, that it really has always come from citizens really kind of putting the issue of basic rights and anti-authoritarianism on the agenda and using it to push the party and candidates in particular to embrace their views. And so, I think that's what has to happen now. It's not going to come necessarily from members of Congress. And, I should say, too, if you want to transition to the Garland point, which is so important, the last part of the book is I interviewed Daniel Ellsberg and two of the living members of the grand jury who tried to indict Richard Nixon. And really what we're facing with Trump and Garland is a failure to ever come to terms with the fact that a president, if he or she commits crime, should be tried and imprisoned, full stop. And this idea of immunity has its origin story in really the failure to indict Nixon, and in the pardon, which hid all of Nixon's crimes so much more than Watergate, the thing that we know about. And if we knew the extent of Nixon's crimes, I believe we would have seen the reason to prosecute them. And there was a nascent citizens movement led by the grand jury, again, two of whom I spoke to. These were ordinary people, low-income people. Ethel Peoples is one of the women I spoke to who was a janitorial worker. And yet they sat there, and as Ethel Peoples says to me in my interview with her, and as I repeat in the book, when I saw the president's crimes, I knew he had to go to prison because he's not any better than any of us. It was just the simplest, most common sense thing. And Garland, for all his learning and his, distinguished career, never saw that. Like, come on, the guy committed a crime. He should have been indicted so much sooner than he was. And I think that with time, that case might have been developed in a way that might have gone better, and at least we would have fought back against the ridiculousness of the immunity case that said that former presidents can't be indicted for their official duties. And if not, then citizens should have demanded, and still should, the reconfiguration of a court that's abandoned the basic idea that no person, not even a president, is above the law.
I mean, I don't know what that reconfiguration looks like, Corey Brettschneider. I mean, you can demand it. I think there is demand for it, but it appears that the president's in control of, and the Senate, of course, in the confirmation process, and the Senate's in the pocket of the president in this instance. It seems as though they're in total control of the disposition of that court and the constituents of that court.
Right. I mean, but, these are all the current design. There's nothing in the Constitution, for instance, that limits the court to 9 people.
Sure.
We did have.
Just to follow up on that, Corey, you'd need the Senate to change that, wouldn't you? You'd need Congress to change that.
Yeah, this isn't something I'm talking about in the near future. I mean, part of the theme of the book, and maybe this will seem less hopeful, is I'm not talking about these resistance movements on behalf of a democratic idea of the Constitution. They never really win in the moment. I mean, the truth of the system that we have is that a president is in power for 4 years, and we could talk about impeachment. That's very unlikely, as we've seen. So what I'm talking about is a long-term recovery that will take another election, that will take the midterms as a sort of way of gearing up. But what we've got to do, and which, and let me just be very blunt, because it isn't just Garland, it's Biden as well. There really was a failure to come to terms with the fact that the structure of American politics is dangerous, because there isn't a way to hold the president to account. And part of it, during the Nixon administration, of course, Nixon fires Archibald Cox, who is pushing towards an indictment of him. And that system that allows a president to essentially, fire the attorney general if he refuses to fire the special prosecutor, and until you get an attorney general who's a lackey, and Nixon found that in Bork, who did fire the special prosecutor. That system that allows that was stopped for a period of time. There was and President Carter, who just passed away, is responsible for it. There was a brief period where Carter signed into law the Independent Counsel, the Ethics in Government Act, which had a law called the Independent Counsel Law. And that structure allowed for an independent prosecutor who couldn't be fired by the president to not only investigate, but arguably indict a president. It was the opposite system of the one that we have now. And although I argued hard, including with members of the inner circle of Biden's inner circle, that we need to return to that law, there was real resistance to it, because the thought was, we'll have another Ken Starr. And look what Ken Starr did to Clinton. And Ken Starr was the last independent prosecutor. And my response to that is, better 10 Ken Starrs than 1 Donald Trump. This is such a dangerous system that we need to have a system in which a president can be held criminally accountable. And this all goes back to the story of Nixon and our failure to really deal with his crimes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This camera just keeps kicking out. I'll deal with it. I wanted to share some comments with you, which I'll do in just a second. Let me just deal with this as
I'm reading them too as we go through.
Yeah, we've gotten some good comments, and so to that end. There is a mechanism to hold a president accountable, impeachment and conviction. The Senate could have convicted and didn't have the balls to do it, says Randy. Of course, that's
and certainly that's right. And I was a huge proponent in both the January 6th case and the first Trump impeachment over the proposed quid pro quo with the president of the Ukraine, certainly for impeachment and conviction. But the reality, here's the sad reality, that I look at in the book, which is that these formal checks, including impeachment, have never worked. During the Andrew Johnson impeachment of the 19th century, a white supremacist president really tried to bring America back to slavery with a different name. There was a serious attempt to remove him as the walking threat to multiracial democracy that he was, and it failed. It came a vote short. And we saw that too during the 2 Trump impeachments. January 6th in particular is such a clear case of where the system was supposed to not only remove a president, but there's a second vote in impeachment after the conviction vote, 2/3, 50% to ensure disqualification, that you could never run again. And that didn't work either. So part of what I'm saying in the book is that, those formal checks that we learned about in grade school, including impeachment, they really aren't the way that we can save things. We really need citizens to demand laws like the independent counsel law, for instance, that will create real criminal accountability.
CC Ryder says the GOP gaslighting line, "We need to come together and heal the country," started after Nixon to protect GOP corruption, to stop investigations or even discussion in the public. But with Democrats, GOP lock her up. It's right. It was more of a reducto that the GOP did with the lock her up. I wanted to push this along to you. Underdog asks, Mr. Brettschneider, could please, it's Professor Brettschneider, if you would, or Corey, could President Biden declassify Jack Smith's classified documents in the January 6th reports on the grounds of national security or on any other grounds?
Well, the real question, I think, in the Jack Smith case, and this goes back to Garland, is whether or not we're going to see the report. And I think that's really the issue here. And the report certainly would talk about the details of what the classified documents were and what happened. And the obvious, if we're not going to have an indictment, obviously we need to see this. And Judge Aileen Cannon has blocked the release. But to my mind, the way that she's done it, if you look at it, she's saying essentially this setup, which is so weak of a special prosecutor, that it is unconstitutional. That's her argument, that a president can't be checked even by this weak special prosecutor. So she's saying everything that Smith did is unconstitutional, including the report, and that's why it can't be released. There's a super easy way around it. Garland, to come back to him, can just say, well, I have this material and I'm not an unconstitutional officer. My position is solidly written into the Constitution and I'm releasing it. And he's got to do that like yesterday because the American people, it's so crucial that we see the crimes. We never saw the crimes in Nixon. We saw Watergate only, not the attempt to kill Daniel Ellsberg, which I talk about on the Capitol steps, not the attempt to blow up the Brookings Institution in order to steal secret material that was in the safe, showing that Nixon had collaborated with the Viet Cong illegally before his election, convincing them to postpone the war until they could get a better deal with him. All those crimes are unknown to the American people, and these crimes will be unknown if Garland doesn't release this report, which he absolutely has to do.
Yeah, the covering the asses of presidents and other key public officials who are involved in these heinous acts is something that America has a pretty gross history with. And I guess I just wanted to revisit that viewer's question. You're saying, and your answer for that matter, you're saying, Garland has the power right now just to release the report. He could do it without any kind,
Her whole argument is about Smith this, Smith that. Okay, fine. It's not about Garland. Garland can just release the report.
Yeah. Wow. Michael Reich says, I can't believe he is getting a skate on the documents case. At a minimum, Cannon should be censured again. I always felt that the documents case, maybe I made this point to you before, I've made it excruciatingly clear over and over and over again. I felt the documents case was the most powerful case from the standpoint of reputational harm to Trump, because I felt as though there's no way you can explain it away. Jacking all those documents, hiding all those documents, keeping them in insecure places, bathrooms, ballrooms, bedrooms, etc. It was so inexcusable and inexplicable that I felt it was a real sad thing that never really got altitude because of a decision to try it in Florida.
Yeah, and I think too, just to go along with that, if the American people could see what the results of this, not just incompetence, this gross neglect or worse. Maybe there's stuff in there, for instance, about selling information or about being compromised. We don't know because we haven't seen the report, so we're speculating. But there's a reason why there are regulations about the safety of national security documents, it's because if it gets into the wrong hands, it's devastating for the country as a whole. And so the harm that was caused, there were people walking around Mar-a-Lago with this stuff so insecure, who weren't looking out for the interests of the United States. They were enemy powers. And the idea that this former president, is somehow competent to hold the highest office, we would have seen how grossly neglectful, incompetent, neglect is too kind a word, really, how hostile he is to American interests. And, the idea that Republicans are about national security, unfortunately, in going along with this wannabe dictator, they've really abandoned even the most basic values of looking out for the safety of American citizens.
Well, I just, as a coda to that, would say the sane washing of Trump, the justification, the rationalization, the way that Sean Hannity and the Laura Ingrams of the world ride to his side and create some bizarre, twisted rationale for whatever he's doing, even now with Greenland. You know what I mean? They're saying, well, this is good for him, for his Louisiana purchase coming to, please. I mean, it's a... So the reflexive musings that he utters out loud of this madman become something that the right rationalizes, and high-profile members of the right wing go up on television and sane wash it for us.
Absolutely, and I have to say too, as obvious a danger as the documents case is to American national security, I think an equally dangerous case, maybe even more in my view, is the January 6th case, which is, after all, is about the attempt to take not just the riot, right, not just the violence at the Capitol, but an attempt to destroy American democracy, to really have a self-coup. And that plot that I talked about that Adams was foiled in because it was discovered, Trump almost carried it out with the help of John Eastman. The idea was, that they would have the vice president play this role that he's absolutely not allowed to play and refuse to certify valid votes, pretending that they were fraudulent or suspect. That would have thrown things to the House of Representatives, where the states vote state by state, and they knew that they had the votes to win there. This thing almost worked. And what would the result have been? It would have been a self-coup. And so I find that to be as horrible as the circumstances of the documents case is. That really was the destruction of American democracy. That was the thing that Patrick Henry was warning about.
The Presidents and the People is his latest. The Presidents and the People, 5 leaders who threatened democracy and the citizens who fought to defend it. We'll have a link to that book under this video. We'll also have a link to Corey's other books. And he has not only The Presidents and the People, but I believe he has the Oath book that I loved. It was The Oath and the Office, it was called. Yeah. The Oath and the Office. So The Presidents and the People and The Oath and the Office, 2 terrific reads from Corey Brettschneider, and we'll have links to both under this video. I know I'll say this with the footnote, Happy New Year, that we may be talking about less than happy things in the days to come, but I so enjoy our time together, Corey. Thanks, you.
Thanks, Mark. I really love joining you. I love the comments of the guests, and we need solidarity to get through what's coming over the next 4 years. So I look forward to more conversations, and Happy New Year, and especially good luck to all of us.
Thanks. Yeah. I'll look forward to our next visit. Thanks. Corey Brettschneider. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.